You think she'll ever find out? My mom whispered, hiding my $108,000 scholarship letter in the attic, not knowing I'd spend years in debt. But when my $4.3 million success went viral, she called me home for a reunion. At the community stage, I pulled out the stolen documents and logged into the screen. Because I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Brooke Harrington, and for most of my life, I thought success came from working harder than everyone else around me. I grew up in Cedar Valley County, a farming community where everybody knew everybody. When I was 15, I had absolutely no plans of becoming a veterinarian. Honestly, I thought I'd stay local, find a decent job, and figure the rest out later. Then, one weekend changed everything. Our neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, showed up looking stressed. A few of his young goats had suddenly gotten sick. He was looking for my dad, but Dad was away helping repair fencing, so I volunteered to help instead. "Brooke, you don't know anything about goats," my mom said. "I know enough to carry buckets." Mr. Jenkins laughed. "Fair point." That afternoon, I followed him around his property while he explained what had been happening. Some goats had stopped eating, others were running fevers. One could barely stand. I remember kneeling beside one of them and feeling fascinated. Not scared, not grossed out. Just curious. Why was it acting differently? Why were some getting better while others got worse? I kept asking questions until Mr. Jenkins finally laughed. "You ask more questions than the actual vet." A few days later, the veterinarian arrived. Her name was Dr. Margaret Collins. Looking back, meeting her changed everything. She wasn't intimidating like I expected. She was calm, practical, and patient. While she examined the animals, I followed her around asking questions. "What does that medicine do? How can you tell what's wrong? Why are you checking that one?" Eventually, she looked up. "Do you always ask this many questions?" I thought she was annoyed. "I'm sorry." She smiled. "Don't apologize. Most people don't ask enough." That sentence stuck with me. After finishing her work, she spent extra time explaining what had happened to the herd. For weeks afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I started reading books, articles, anything I could find about livestock health. While my friends talked about football games and driver's licenses, I was reading about animal diseases. A month later, Margaret came back to check on the herd. To my surprise, she remembered my name. "Still reading?" she asked. "Maybe." She laughed. "That's a yes." From then on, every visit turned into a conversation. At first, she answered questions. Then she started letting me help, taking temperatures, recording observations, simple things. But she treated those small tasks like they mattered. And because she did, I did too. One afternoon, after visiting several farms, we sat on the tailgate of her truck eating sandwiches. "How long have you been doing this?" I asked. "Long enough to know when somebody enjoys the work." I shrugged. "I just think it's interesting." Margaret smiled. "That's usually how it starts." For the first time, I imagined doing it as a career. The idea felt ridiculous. Nobody in my family worked in veterinary medicine, but once the thought appeared, it refused to leave. Over the next year, Margaret became one of the most important people in my life, not because she pushed me, because she believed in me before I believed in myself. One day, she invited me to a veterinary conference a few counties away. I felt completely out of place. Everyone seemed smarter and more experienced. Then Margaret introduced me to several veterinarians, not as a kid, not as someone tagging along. She looked at them and said, "This is Brooke. She's going to be one of us someday." I laughed. She didn't. On the drive home, I finally asked, "You really think I could do that?" I wouldn't have said it if I didn't. A few days later, she asked me to stop by her clinic after school. When I arrived, she handed me a stack of brochures and application forms. I looked down at the top page, one of the most respected veterinary programs in the region. My stomach tightened. Those schools are for people way smarter than me. She shook her head. No, those schools are for students willing to work. Then she tapped the application packet in my hands, and for the first time, the dream felt close enough to reach. I carried those application packets around for nearly a week before I actually started filling them out. Not because I wasn't interested, because every time I looked at them, I heard the same thought. People like me don't get into schools like that. Margaret refused to let me get away with that attitude. Every time I stopped by her clinic, she'd ask the same question. How's the application coming? I always had an excuse. I'm still working on the essay. I need to double-check something. I'm busy with school. Eventually, she looked at me and said, Brooke, are you trying to get accepted? Or are you trying to find reasons not to apply? That one stung, because she was right. A few days later, I finally started the applications. The essays were the hardest part. Every draft felt wrong. Margaret would read them and hand them back covered in notes. Stop writing what you think they want, she told me. Tell them who you are. Little by little, the applications came together. For the first time, college stopped feeling like some distant idea. It felt real. That was exciting. And terrifying. At home, my mom seemed less excited. At first, I didn't think much of it. One evening, she found me comparing veterinary programs at the dining room table. She glanced at the brochures. How far away are these places? A few hours. A few hours? She repeated. Some of them? She folded her arms. Seems pretty far just to learn how to take care of animals. I laughed awkwardly. She didn't. The conversation ended there. I figured she was worried. Most parents probably would be. A week later, she asked how much college would cost. When I told her, she whistled softly. That's a lot of money. It is? And there's no guarantee you'll make it back. I shrugged. I know. She nodded but didn't look convinced. Again, I assumed she was concerned. Nothing more. Dad handled it differently. He rarely offered opinions. One night, he looked over an application packet sitting on the counter. Looks complicated. It is. He handed it back. You'll figure it out. That was pretty much the entire conversation. Not exactly encouragement, but in my family, that almost counted as support. The months passed faster than I expected. School, applications, clinic visits, volunteer work, interview preparation. It felt like every free hour disappeared into planning for a future I wasn't even sure would happen. Most of my friends were making very different plans for their future. More than once, I wondered if they had the right idea. No debt. No risk. No moving away. No uncertainty. Then I'd spend a day with Margaret and remember why I was doing it. One afternoon, she let me observe while she treated an injured calf. Afterward, she handed me a clipboard. You notice things most people miss. I laughed. Is that supposed to make me feel better? Yes. She smiled slightly. Good veterinarians pay attention. Comments like that kept me going. Not because they made me confident. Because they made me think maybe confidence wasn't required. Maybe I just needed to keep moving. By spring, every application was finally finished. Every essay, every recommendation letter, every form. I checked everything so many times I practically memorized it. Then came the hardest part. Sending them. I remember standing at the post office holding the envelope addressed to Blue Ridge Veterinary Program, the school that felt completely out of reach, the school Margaret wanted me to aim for anyway. Ready? The clerk asked. I stared at the envelope for a second, then slid it across the counter. Yeah, I said. I think so. Driving home, I felt strangely lighter. For months, I'd been working toward that moment. Now there was nothing left to do except wait. And waiting turned out to be harder than applying. Every afternoon I checked the mailbox. Every afternoon I wondered if something had arrived. Most days it was just bills, advertisements, and local flyers. My mom started checking the mail more often too. At first I barely noticed. Then one afternoon I pulled into the driveway and saw her already standing by the mailbox. She looked down at a stack of envelopes before quickly tucking them under her arm. When she saw me, she smiled. Nothing important today. Then she turned and headed back toward the house. And for some reason, I stood there watching her a little longer than usual. I became obsessed with checking the mailbox. Not in a dramatic way. Just enough that every afternoon followed the same routine. Pull into the driveway, walk to the mailbox, hope for something different. Most days, there wasn't. Bills, advertisements, farm supply catalogs. The kind of mail nobody gets excited about. Weeks passed, then more weeks. A few colleges responded. Some accepted me. A couple offered partial financial aid. I should have been happy. Instead, I kept waiting for one particular envelope. Blue Ridge. The school Margaret believed I could get into. The school I secretly wanted more than any other. Every time the mail arrived and it wasn't there, I told myself to be patient. Eventually, patience turned into doubt. Then doubt turned into embarrassment. One afternoon, Margaret asked how things were going. I shrugged. Haven't heard from Blue Ridge? Not yet. I shook my head. She frowned slightly. That's unusual. The comment stuck with me. Not because she sounded worried, because she sounded confused. For a few days, I tried convincing myself it didn't mean anything. Schools got busy. Mail got delayed. There were 100 possible explanations. Then another acceptance letter arrived from a different university. Still nothing from Blue Ridge. At some point, I stopped expecting good news. I never received a rejection letter. Never received an acceptance letter either. Just silence. And eventually, silence starts sounding like an answer. One evening, I was sitting at the kitchen table staring at an empty spot on the calendar where I had written, Blue Ridge? My mom walked by and glanced down. You still waiting on that school? Yeah, she nodded. Then, almost casually, she said, Maybe they already made their decision. I looked up. What do you mean? She shrugged. Not everyone gets accepted, Brooke. The way she said it wasn't cruel. Just matter of fact. Like she was helping me accept reality. A few days later, I finally stopped checking the mailbox with the same excitement. Not because I wanted to, because I was tired. Tired of waiting. Tired of wondering. Tired of feeling stupid every time another day passed. So I made a decision. If Blue Ridge wanted me, they would have contacted me by now. That was the conclusion I settled on. Right or wrong, I called Margaret and told her. There was a pause on the other end. A longer pause than I expected. So that's it? She asked. What else am I supposed to do? I don't know. She sounded disappointed. I just thought you'd fight a little harder for this one. The comment hit harder than I wanted to admit. I did fight. My voice came out sharper than intended. I applied. I waited. They never answered. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she sighed. Fair enough. But she didn't sound convinced. When we hung up, I sat there staring at my phone. For the first time since meeting her, it felt like I'd let her down. Life moved forward anyway. One of the schools that had accepted me offered partial aid. Not enough to make things easy. Enough to make attendance possible. I spent the summer filling out paperwork, housing forms, financial aid forms, loan documents. So many loan documents. Every signature felt heavier than the last. Dad helped me load boxes into the truck before move-in day. Mom spent most of the morning giving practical advice. Don't forget to lock your car. Watch your spending. Call home once in a while. Normal parent stuff. Nothing seemed unusual. If anything, she looked relieved that a decision had finally been made. The campus was bigger than anything I'd ever lived around. For the first few weeks, I felt like everybody else knew exactly what they were doing. Meanwhile, I was getting lost between buildings and pretending I understood how college worked. Still, I loved the classes, especially anything involving animal science. Whenever things got difficult, that part reminded me why I was there. Then the first semester bill arrived. I remember opening it in my dorm room. At first, I scanned the numbers without really thinking. Then I looked again. And again. The amount still didn't seem real, even after financial aid. Even after every grant and discount, there was still more money owed than I had ever personally seen. I sat there staring at the screen. A few minutes later, I opened the student loan paperwork I'd already signed. For the first time, I stopped looking at college as something that cost money. I started looking at it as debt. A lot of debt. And judging by the numbers in front of me, it wasn't going away anytime soon. The first year nearly broke me. Not academically, financially. Every time a new semester started, I promised myself I'd stay ahead. Then another bill would arrive. Another expense would pop up. Another shift would get added to my schedule. By sophomore year, my life ran on a pretty simple cycle. Classes, work, study, sleep, repeat. I worked wherever I could find hours, campus jobs, weekend shifts, seasonal work, anything that helped cover expenses. Most of my classmates seemed to have free time. I had a calculator. I don't mean that as a complaint. It was just reality. Every decision had a price attached to it. Could I afford this textbook? Could I afford that certification course? Could I afford gas to get to an internship? Those questions followed me everywhere. The strange part was that I got used to it. Human beings adapt faster than they should. By my second year, 12-hour days felt normal. By my third year, exhaustion felt normal too. One afternoon, a classmate looked at me and said, "Do you ever stop working?" I laughed. Occasionally. She didn't look convinced. Honestly, neither was I. The internships helped. They were exhausting, but they reminded me why I started all of this. I spent time on farms, worked alongside experienced veterinarians, and saw firsthand how much livestock health affected entire communities. Every successful treatment felt rewarding. Every mistake taught me something. For the first time, I wasn't just learning veterinary medicine. I was actually practicing pieces of it. Those experiences kept me moving when everything else felt overwhelming. Home felt different. Not bad. Just distant. Phone calls became less frequent. When I called, conversations rarely lasted long. Mom usually asked practical questions. "How are classes?" "Good." "You eating enough?" "I think so." "Okay." Then the conversation would drift toward local gossip or community events. Nobody really asked how I was managing everything: the loans, the jobs, the stress. Eventually, I stopped bringing those things up. Dad remained mostly the same: quiet, supportive in his own way, but never particularly involved. Months would pass without any meaningful conversation. The longer I stayed away, the more it felt like I was building a life that existed separately from home. Margaret was different. She checked in constantly. Not every day, not every week. Just enough that I always knew she was paying attention. Sometimes she'd leave a voicemail. Sometimes she'd send a short email. Occasionally she'd call while driving between farms. "Still surviving?" "Mostly." "Good, keep going." That was usually the conversation. Simple, but it mattered. More than she probably realized. One winter during finals week, I called her feeling completely overwhelmed. I had 2 exams left, almost no money, and another loan statement sitting on my desk. For 10 straight minutes, I complained. When I finally ran out of things to say, she waited a second and asked, You finished yet? I laughed despite myself. I think so. Good. That's your advice? Yep. I shook my head. Terrible advice. No, she said. Terrible situations don't last forever. That sentence carried me through more than one difficult semester. Years passed faster than I expected. One class turned into 10. One semester turned into 8. Somehow I made it to senior year. Then graduation. The morning felt surreal. Everybody was taking pictures. Parents were celebrating. Students were talking about jobs and future plans. For a few hours, nobody mentioned exams, tuition, or stress. Just accomplishment. I spotted Margaret in the crowd before the ceremony started. She waved from across the field. The second I saw her, I smiled. She'd been there from the beginning, long before college, long before internships, long before any degree. When my name was called, I walked across that stage knowing she was probably more excited than I was. Afterward, she pulled me into a hug. Told you, I laughed. You tell everybody that. No. She stepped back. I only tell the ones who prove me right. For a little while, everything felt worth it. The years, the sacrifices, the late nights, the endless work. Then a few days later, reality returned. I sat at my apartment table opening documents I'd spent years trying not to think about. Loan summaries, repayment schedules, interest projections, page after page of numbers. I added everything together twice because I thought I had made a mistake. Then I checked again. The total stayed exactly the same. Nearly $167,000. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the number for a long time. Graduation was finally behind me. But according to the paperwork sitting in front of me, something else was just beginning. $167,000. That number followed me everywhere. Not physically, mentally. Every decision I made during those first years after graduation somehow connected back to it. Where I worked, how many hours I worked, what risks I could afford to take. The easiest option would have been finding a stable position at an established clinic, a regular paycheck, predictable hours, less uncertainty. Instead, I did something that probably looked irresponsible to everyone around me. I started a mobile livestock practice. Basically, I drove to the animals instead of asking farmers to bring them to me. In rural communities, that mattered. Many livestock owners didn't have the equipment or time to transport sick animals long distances. The idea made sense, at least to me. The problem was convincing other people. I was young. Really young compared to most veterinarians serving those areas. More than once, I pulled into a farm and watched someone glance past me, clearly expecting the actual veterinarian to arrive. One rancher looked around my truck and asked, "So when's the doctor getting here?" I smiled. "You're talking to her." The man blinked, then laughed. "I thought you were the assistant." "Not today." To be fair, he wasn't trying to be rude. Most of them weren't. They just weren't used to seeing someone my age doing that job. Trust took time. A lot of time. The first year felt like a never-ending audition. Every farm visit mattered. Every recommendation mattered. Every treatment mattered. One mistake could cost an animal. Or a client. Sometimes both. There were weeks when I barely felt like I was making progress. Then something small would happen. A farmer would call me back for another visit. Someone would recommend me to a neighbor. A family I'd helped months earlier would send a thank you card. Little things. But little things add up. Gradually, the phone started ringing more often. My schedule filled up. The debt was still there. The stress was still there. But for the first time, it felt like I was building something. One afternoon, I was checking cattle on a farm I'd visited several times before. The owner pointed toward a section of fencing. "Lost another one last week." I looked up. "What happened?" He shook his head. "Not sure." That answer sounded familiar. too familiar, because I'd heard versions of it over and over. Different farms, different animals, same story. By the time someone noticed something was wrong, it was often too late. A fever went unnoticed. An infection spread. An animal stopped eating. A behavioral change got dismissed as nothing important. Then a few days later, there was a loss nobody could reverse. At first, I treated each case separately. Then I started noticing patterns. The same preventable problems kept appearing. Again, and again, and again. One evening, I was talking with Margaret about it. We'd managed to grab coffee between appointments. I was venting more than anything. Half these situations could be avoided if people caught the warning signs earlier. Margaret nodded. You're probably right. They don't see the changes soon enough. Most people are busy. I know. I rubbed my forehead. But there has to be a better way. She didn't argue. She just listened. That was one of the things she did best. A few months later, I got a call just before midnight. Emergency cases never arrive at convenient times. This one involved a small herd several counties away. The farmer sounded worried before I even reached the property. When I arrived, he met me outside with a flashlight. "You think we're too late?" he asked. I didn't answer right away. I needed to see the animals first. For the next couple of hours, I worked through examinations, treatments, and questions. Some animals responded well. Others worried me. By the time everything settled down, the sky was beginning to lighten. The farmer looked exhausted. Honestly, so was I. We stood near the fence watching the herd. Finally, he shook his head. I wish I'd known sooner. That sentence hit harder than he realized. Not because it was unusual, because I'd heard it dozens of times before. I wish I'd known sooner. Driving home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The roads were empty. The sun was just starting to rise. And somewhere between that farm and my apartment, an idea appeared. A simple one. What if farmers didn't have to wait until something looked obviously wrong? What if they could spot the warning signs before the crisis started? I kept turning the thought over in my head. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I was still thinking about it. And unlike most late-night ideas, this one didn't disappear when the morning came. The idea sounded much smarter at 5 in the morning than it did a week later. I was sitting at my kitchen table surrounded by notes, coffee cups, and sketches that looked like they had been drawn by a distracted middle school student. The question itself was simple. How could farmers know something was wrong before an animal showed obvious symptoms? The answer was not. I wasn't an engineer. I wasn't a software developer. I was a veterinarian with student loans and a pickup truck. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every farm visit reinforced the same problem. Animals often showed warning signs long before a crisis. Changes in movement, activity, body temperature. The problem wasn't the lack of signs. The problem was that nobody could monitor dozens of animals at once. One evening, I called Margaret. "I think I'm losing my mind." She laughed. That's usually how innovation starts. I explained the idea. The sensors, the monitoring, the alerts, the possibility of spotting problems before farmers could. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Sounds ambitious." "That's a polite way of saying impossible." "No," she replied. "It's a polite way of saying difficult." For some reason, that felt encouraging. So I kept working. Days became weeks. Whenever I wasn't treating animals, I was researching, reading articles, watching presentations, talking to people who knew more than I did. A surprising number of those conversations ended with someone explaining why the idea wouldn't work. The batteries wouldn't last. The sensors would fail. The costs would be too high. Farmers wouldn't use it. Some of the criticism was probably valid, but every objection made me want to solve the problem more. The first prototype was embarrassing. I remember showing it to a farmer named Carl. He stared at it for several seconds. Is this supposed to stay attached? Hopefully. Hopefully? That's not the confidence-building response I wanted to give. Carl laughed. I appreciate the honesty. A few days later, the device stopped working. Then another failed. Then another. At one point, I spent an entire weekend fixing a problem caused by a component that cost less than $1. Failures became part of the process. Annoying, expensive, necessary. Fortunately, a few farmers believed in me enough to keep helping. Carl was one of them. Another farmer named Linda volunteered part of her herd for testing. Neither of them were getting paid. They simply wanted a better way to protect their animals. That support mattered more than they knew, because there were plenty of moments when quitting would have been easier. One afternoon, I received a text from Carl. Just 3 words. Check your dashboard. I opened the monitoring system. One animal had triggered an alert. Nothing dramatic. Just unusual activity patterns. Carl checked the animal and called me back later. You might be onto something. What happened? Early infection. I sat up straighter. Seriously? Vet caught it before it got worse. For the first time, the system had identified a problem before anyone noticed visible symptoms. Not perfectly, not consistently, but it had worked. That single success carried me through months of frustration. More improvements followed. The alerts became more accurate. The hardware became more reliable. Word started spreading through local farming communities. Slowly at first, then faster. Every success created another conversation. Every conversation created another test user. My mobile practice was still my main job. The technology project still felt like a side experiment. But people were becoming curious. A few agricultural groups invited me to give presentations. Farmers started asking questions, not whether it worked, how soon they could get access to it. One evening, I was reviewing reports when my phone rang. The number wasn't familiar. Hello? A professional voice answered. Dr. Harrington? Yes. My name is Rachel Porter. I'm calling from Prairie Livestock Systems. I recognized the company immediately. They were far larger than anything I had ever worked with. We've been following your monitoring project, she said. My grip tightened around the phone. Oh? We'd like to schedule a formal meeting. And suddenly the project that had started as late-night sketches on my kitchen table felt a lot bigger than I had planned for. I spent most of the meeting expecting someone to tell me they had called the wrong person. Prairie Livestock Systems was a national company. I was still a veterinarian who spent half her week driving dirt roads between farms. The difference felt enormous. Rachel and several executives joined the meeting. They asked about the monitoring system, testing results, adoption rates, and the technology behind the alerts. At first I was nervous. Then something unexpected happened. They weren't treating me like someone pitching an idea. They were treating me like someone who had already built something valuable. When the meeting ended, Rachel smiled. We think this could scale nationally. I tried not to react. That's a pretty big statement. We don't make it lightly. A few weeks later, negotiations started. Then more meetings. Then lawyers. Then paperwork. Eventually, Prairie offered a partnership that would expand the technology across multiple states. The agreement included a leadership role helping oversee future development. The compensation package was larger than anything I had imagined. For several minutes after reading the proposal, I simply stared at the screen. The girl who had worried about textbook costs was now looking at numbers that didn't seem real. The first person I called was Margaret. You sound strange, she said. I got the offer. A pause. Then another. Margaret? I'm here. You okay? She laughed softly. I'm just trying not to start crying before lunch. That made both of us laugh. Over the next few months, everything accelerated. Industry publications started mentioning the project. Agricultural organizations invited me to speak. People I'd never met somehow knew who I was. The attention felt awkward more than exciting. I was much more comfortable discussing livestock health than discussing myself. Then Business Today magazine reached out. A reporter wanted to feature my career, the technology, and the journey behind it. The interview lasted nearly 2 hours. I talked about the farmers who helped test the system. I talked about Margaret. I talked about debt, long hours, and persistence. A few weeks later, the article was published, and suddenly people from my past started appearing. Former classmates, distant acquaintances, people I hadn't heard from in years. Most of it was harmless. Then my mother called. That was different, because my mother rarely called first. When I answered, her voice sounded unusually cheerful. "Brooke!" The enthusiasm caught me off guard. "Hi, Mom." "I saw the article." I figured. Everyone saw the article. Apparently, the magazine had made its way all over Cedar Valley County. For several minutes, she talked about how proud everyone was. Neighbors, community leaders, farmers, friends. The conversation felt warmer than most we'd had in years. At first, I enjoyed it. Then I noticed something. She spent a lot of time talking about my success. Very little time talking about me. It was subtle. Just enough to stand out. Before hanging up, she brought up something else. "We're having a family reunion next month." "A reunion?" "Everyone's coming." That alone wasn't unusual. Then she added, "It falls on the same weekend as the annual livestock celebration." Now that got my attention. The livestock celebration was one of the biggest events in the county. Farmers, business owners, community leaders, practically everyone attended. "You should come," Mom said. "I've been pretty busy." "I know." Her tone became firmer. "But this one matters." I hesitated. "We'd really love to have you here, Brooke." The wording felt strange. Not wrong. Just different. After we ended the call, I sat staring at my phone. A little later, Margaret called. Apparently, she'd already heard about the invitation. Small towns work that way. "You going?" she asked. "I haven't decided." "What does your gut say?" I looked out the window. Nothing about the invitation sounded suspicious. A family reunion, a community event, a chance to visit home, completely normal. And yet, something about the timing felt almost too perfect. A little too sudden. When Mom called again 2 days later, I finally gave her an answer. "Okay," I said. "I'll be there." She sounded relieved almost immediately, and for some reason, that reaction stayed with me long after the call ended. The reunion felt strange before I even got out of the truck. Not bad, just unfamiliar. People who hadn't spoken to me in years suddenly wanted to catch up. Neighbors waved. Old family friends stopped me to say they had read the article. A few people even asked for photos. I smiled through most of it. But part of me kept noticing how different the attention felt. Back when I was struggling through college, hardly anyone had asked how things were going. Now everybody seemed interested. Mom was especially enthusiastic. She introduced me to people I already knew, repeated parts of my story, talked about the technology, talked about the magazine article, talked about the partnership. More than once, I found myself standing quietly while someone else explained my own life. At one point, Dad leaned over and muttered, "You're the celebrity this weekend." I laughed. Let's hope that's temporary. Probably. That was the longest conversation we'd had in months. The following morning, preparations started for some renovation work on an old storage building near the family property. The structure had been there for decades. Most people treated it like a giant attic. Nobody seemed entirely sure what was inside anymore. A few relatives volunteered to help clean it out. Unfortunately, saying yes to things is apparently a lifelong habit of mine, so I ended up helping. The building was packed with old furniture, tools, holiday decorations, and boxes that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. For a while, the work was almost enjoyable. People joked, told stories, argued about whether random objects should be saved or thrown away. Normal family stuff. Then I found a stack of old filing boxes pushed into the back corner. They were covered in dust. Nothing about them looked important. I almost carried them straight to the discard pile. Almost. One box felt unusually heavy. Curious, I opened it. Inside were folders, receipts, old insurance papers, tax records, the kind of paperwork most people forget exists. I started sorting through it without thinking much about it. Then I noticed my name. Just one file among dozens. Brooke Harrington. I paused. That was unexpected. At first, I assumed it contained school records or medical forms. Something ordinary. Instead, I found application paperwork, academic records, recommendation letters, copies of forms I vaguely remembered completing during high school. For a second, I simply stared at them. Why would these still be here? Most of this should have been thrown away years ago, or given to me. I flipped through another folder, then another. The deeper I looked, the stranger it became. Everything seemed connected to my college applications. Some documents I'd completely forgotten existed. Others I had never seen before. Around me, relatives continued cleaning and talking. Nobody paid attention to what I was doing. I sat down on an old folding chair and kept reading. The air suddenly felt warmer. My hands felt strangely unsteady. Then I found a large envelope folded between several files. The return address immediately caught my attention. Blue Ridge Veterinary Program. I froze. For a moment, I genuinely thought it had to be something else. Maybe promotional material, maybe information I had requested, maybe a duplicate. Anything except what my brain was beginning to suspect. Slowly, I opened it. Inside was an acceptance packet. Official letterhead, admissions documents, enrollment information. Every page looked legitimate. Every page had my name on it. I read the first paragraph twice, then a third time. The words didn't change. Congratulations. Accepted. Admitted. Selected. My chest tightened. Years earlier, I had waited for that letter, checked the mailbox every day, wondered what happened. Eventually convinced myself I hadn't gotten in. But the letter had existed the entire time. It had arrived. It had been delivered. And somehow it had ended up sitting in a storage box, hidden among old paperwork. I kept turning pages, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Nothing made sense. Then another document slipped partially out of the folder. A financial aid statement. I pulled it free. At first, I only glanced at the numbers. Then I looked again. And this time, I read every line carefully. The scholarship wasn't small. It wasn't partial. It wasn't even close. The amount printed on the page was larger than anything I had ever imagined receiving as a student. I sat completely still, staring at the figure while voices echoed somewhere behind me, and suddenly all I could think was one question. If this package had been here all along, who made sure I never saw it? I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was confused. Confused would have been easier. What I felt was something closer to disbelief. The acceptance letter sat on the hotel desk beside me. So did the scholarship documents. I must have read them 20 times. Every time the result was the same. I had been accepted. Not waitlisted, not rejected. Accepted. The financial aid paperwork was even harder to process. For years, I had believed I simply wasn't good enough to get into Blue Ridge. I had built an entire story around that assumption. The school chose someone else. Life moved on. I adapted. That explanation had carried me through college, debt, and every difficult year afterward. Now the explanation was sitting in front of me in pieces. And it wasn't true. I opened the folder again. This time I focused on dates. Mailing dates. Processing dates. Response deadlines. Every page told the same story. The packet had been prepared, sent, delivered. Nothing suggested it had been lost. Nothing suggested the school had made a mistake. The timeline was clean, almost painfully clean. I grabbed my laptop and started digging. Part of me hoped I would find something that proved I was overreacting. Some administrative error. Some missing detail. Anything. Instead, every record seemed to support what was already sitting on the desk. Blue Ridge had done exactly what they were supposed to do. I even found archived emails from years ago. Not many. Just enough. One confirmed receipt of application materials. Another referenced admission documents being sent. I stared at the screen. The knot in my stomach tightened. For years I had blamed circumstances. Bad luck, timing, my own limitations. Now those explanations were disappearing one by one. The hardest part wasn't realizing what happened. The hardest part was realizing what probably didn't happen. My opportunity hadn't vanished. It hadn't slipped through the cracks. Someone had made a choice. The question was who. And deep down, I already knew where my thoughts kept leading. I hated that. Because once you start questioning trust, everything gets re-examined. Little memories began resurfacing. Mom asking about the mail. Mom reaching the mailbox before I did. Mom questioning every college application. Mom constantly finding reasons why leaving home wasn't practical. At the time, I had interpreted those moments as concern, a worried parent, a protective mother. Nothing unusual. Now those same memories looked different. Not completely different, just enough to make me uncomfortable. I called Margaret. She answered almost immediately. Everything okay? No. The word came out faster than I intended. A pause followed. Then her voice softened. Talk to me. I explained what I had found. The storage boxes, the acceptance packet, the scholarship documents, the delivery dates. The silence on the other end lasted longer this time. Finally, she spoke. Brooke, you knew I got accepted? No. Her answer came instantly. If I'd known, I would have driven to your house myself. I believed her. Not because I wanted to, because it sounded exactly like something Margaret would have done. I thought I failed, I said quietly. I know. Neither of us spoke for a few seconds. Then she asked, What are you going to do? That was the question. The obvious answer was confrontation. March straight into the house, drop the documents on the kitchen table, demand explanations. Part of me wanted that, a very large part. But another part kept replaying something else. The reunion, the livestock celebration, the speeches, the sudden interest, the carefully timed invitation. I looked at the papers spread across the desk. Then I looked out the window. Cars were already arriving for the community event scheduled later that day. People were gathering, setting up booths, preparing for presentations. The whole town would be there, including my family, including my mother. I don't know yet, I said. Margaret didn't sound convinced. Just don't make a decision while you're angry. I won't. That was technically true, because anger wasn't the strongest feeling anymore. Certainty was. For years I had wondered what happened to my opportunity. Now I knew it hadn't disappeared. Someone had buried it. When the call ended, I carefully placed every document back into the folder. Then I slid the folder into my bag. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed. A text from Mom. Hope you're almost here. Everyone's excited to see you. I stared at the message, then looked at the folder again. For the first time since finding the documents, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront her privately. I wasn't going to cancel my appearance. And I definitely wasn't going home. Instead, I picked up my bag, headed for the door, and drove toward the community celebration exactly as planned. The livestock celebration looked exactly the way I remembered. Rows of booths, local vendors, farm families catching up, kids running around with lemonade and funnel cakes. On the surface, it felt like any other year. The difference was me. People kept stopping me every few minutes. Some wanted to congratulate me. Some wanted to ask about the technology. Others just wanted to talk about the magazine article. I smiled and answered questions. But the folder in my bag never left my mind. Mom seemed everywhere at once, greeting people, organizing volunteers, introducing guests. She looked completely at home. To be fair, she usually did. Denise Harrington had spent years building a reputation in Cedar Valley County. Most people respected her. Many admired her. By late afternoon, the main program began. Community leaders gave speeches. Sponsors were recognized. Awards were handed out. Eventually, someone announced my name. The crowd applauded. I waved politely and sat back down. A few moments later, Mom walked onto the stage. My stomach tightened. Not because I was surprised, because I knew exactly where this was going. She smiled at the audience. "Most of you know my daughter Brooke," she began. A few people laughed. Then she started telling stories. Stories from my childhood. Stories from the farm. Stories about hard work. The audience loved it. Then the stories shifted. Not dramatically. Just enough. Mom talked about supporting my dreams, encouraging my education, helping me pursue opportunities. The more she spoke, the more uncomfortable I became, because parts of it were true, just not all of it. The audience had no reason to doubt her. She sounded sincere, confident, proud. At one point, she looked toward me. "We always knew Brooke was capable of extraordinary things." Applause filled the room again. For years, this was the version of the story everyone had heard. The supportive family, the determined daughter, the happy success story. Simple, easy to believe. Mom finished to loud applause. Then the coordinator stepped back to the microphone. "And now we'd like to hear from Dr. Brooke Harrington." I stood, picked up my folder, and walked toward the stage. The strange thing was that I wasn't nervous anymore. Everything felt oddly calm. I thanked the audience, thanked the local farmers who had trusted me early in my career. Then I started telling my version of the story. Not the polished version, the real one. I talked about working through college, about juggling classes and jobs, about graduating with debt that followed me for years. The room grew quieter. Nobody interrupted. Nobody looked away. Then I paused. For the first time all afternoon, I looked directly at my parents. Mom's smile had faded. I reached into the folder. Several people leaned forward. "I always believed I wasn't accepted into my first choice veterinary program," I said. "I thought I simply wasn't selected." The crowd remained silent. But yesterday, while helping clean out an old storage building, I found something unexpected. I held up the acceptance packet. Confusion spread across faces. "This is my original acceptance letter." A murmur moved through the audience, and attached to it was a scholarship offer. I walked to the presentation laptop and displayed the documents on the large screen. The dates, the signatures, the scholarship amount, every detail visible. People stopped whispering. Some stared at the screen. Others looked toward my family. I wasn't arguing. I wasn't accusing anyone. I was simply showing what existed. The documents spoke for themselves. I looked back at the audience. Nobody was clapping anymore. The entire room seemed frozen. Then a chair scraped against the floor near the front row. I turned. My father was standing. And for the first time that day, he looked directly at the stage. "I need to say something." Thomas rarely spoke in public. That was probably why the room became even quieter when he stood up. My father slowly walked toward the stage. Mom stayed frozen in her seat. When he reached the microphone, he cleared his throat. "I don't know exactly what's in those documents," he said, "but I know enough." A murmur moved through the crowd. Mom immediately shook her head. "Thomas." He didn't look at her. "I know that acceptance letter arrived." The room went silent. My chest tightened. "I never opened it," he continued, "but I saw it." He paused. "I asked about it once. Your mother told me she was handling it." Mom stood abruptly. "It wasn't that simple." Dad looked tired. "Maybe not." Then he said the sentence that hurt the most. "I should have asked more questions." For years I had blamed bad luck and missed opportunities. Now my father was admitting the truth had been sitting in front of him the entire time. Mom tried again. "I was trying to protect our family." "Protect us from what?" I asked. For a moment she didn't answer. Then her shoulders dropped. "You were leaving." The words came out quietly. "You were always going to leave." Suddenly, years of comments and discouragement made sense. The concerns about money, the pressure to stay close to home, the constant doubts. It wasn't only concern, it was fear. Fear that had made a decision that wasn't hers to make. Nobody applauded. Nobody cheered. The event ended early. People slowly filtered out. Some stopped to speak with me. Others spoke with Dad. Very few approached Mom. That part was harder than I expected. No matter what she had done, she was still my mother. The story spread quickly through town. People began reevaluating assumptions they had held for years. Dad started calling more often. The conversations were awkward at first. Weather, livestock markets, anything except what had happened. Eventually he said, "I know sorry doesn't fix it." "No," I replied. "It doesn't." A brief silence followed. "But I appreciate hearing it." Mom called too, several times. I wasn't ready to have that conversation. Not yet. A month later, Prairie expanded the monitoring system into several new states. The project kept growing. More farms, more communities, more animals protected. The success felt good. But it wasn't what I kept thinking about. I kept thinking about 17-year-old Brooke, the girl who thought she wasn't good enough, the girl who never got the chance to choose. One afternoon I called Margaret. "Remember that conference you took me to?" She laughed. "The one where you thought you didn't belong?" "Exactly." "What about it?" "I want to help somebody else get there." A few months later, we launched the Margaret Collins Education Fund. Its goal was simple: help students from rural communities pursue veterinary education. Margaret cried when we announced it. She still denies it, but she absolutely cried. The first scholarship recipient was a 19-year-old student from a farming family a few counties away. When I met her, she looked nervous, excited, and completely overwhelmed. She held her acceptance packet with both hands. "I still can't believe this is real," she said. I smiled. I know the feeling. A few weeks later, she left for school. Watching her go, I thought about how differently my own story might have unfolded. What was taken from me could never be returned. The debt happened. The struggle happened. Nothing changes that. But the opportunity that was taken from me became an opportunity I could give to someone else. And somehow, that felt like a better ending than revenge ever would have. I'm curious what you think. If a family member secretly changed the course of your future years earlier, would you try to rebuild the relationship? Or would some things be too difficult to forgive? Let me know in the comments.